They told me to neutralize my accent. Today, I'm the one who decides the standard. I remember the look exactly. It was my first day at an American company, newly hired, full of enthusiasm, with a sharp resume, fluent English, with an accent, yes, but fluent. And as soon as I opened my mouth in the meeting, the first cut came. One of the directors, without hesitation, blurted out, "It would be good if you could neutralize your accent. It makes communication easier." That wasn't a technical tip. It was a veiled warning. You don't belong. The problem was never my communication, but their discomfort with what it represented, a break from the norm. At that moment, I realized that it wasn't enough to be good. I had to be better, more strategic, and most importantly, I would have to carry with me all those who were also silenced by the sound of their origin. Little did they know that their attempt to silence me would be precisely the impetus for me to reach the top and rewrite the rules of the game. The first time I was asked to repeat a sentence more clearly, I thought it was just noise from the connection. We were on a call with the onboarding team, and while I was talking about the strategies I used in the last project, which had increased performance by 18%, they interrupted me mid-sentence. "Sorry, can you say that again? I think the audio is a bit off." But it wasn't the audio. It was the way I spoke. My rhythm, my accent, the way I constructed sentences that carry the soul of someone who grew up translating thoughts between two worlds. I didn't speak incorrectly. I never did. I just didn't speak like they did. And that, right there, in that environment, seemed like a serious mistake. Over the next few days, I began to notice a pattern. Every time I spoke, there was a pause, a micro moment of hesitation, as if my speech needed to be decoded, as if my presence were a breach of expectations. Because the truth is that in American corporate environments, even with all the diversity flags flying on institutional websites, there is still a crystallized idea of what professionalism is. And this idea almost always excludes those who are different. An accent is like an invisible flag. It says, even without meaning to, I came from somewhere else. And in the place where I was, this was seen as a problem that needed to be fixed. At the cafe, a colleague said, almost playfully, "Dude, your English is good, but if you can sound a little more American, you might even be able to climb the ladder faster." It was supposed to be advice. Friendly, according to him. But what he was really saying, without even realizing it, was, you will only be accepted if you hide who you are. And that's the cruelest part of linguistic prejudice. It comes disguised as advice, as concern for your advancement. But in reality, it's an attempt to erase you. And the worst part, many give in. They go home, practice their pronunciation, change their cadence, try to imitate, and little by little, they begin to disappear from themselves. But I chose not to follow that path, and it wasn't out of pride, it was out of survival. Because I knew that if I tried to erase myself to fit in, there wouldn't be anything left that made me truly valuable. My accent wasn't a noise, it was a signal. A reminder that there were different voices that deserved space too. That diversity couldn't just be about hiring people from different backgrounds, but about allowing those people to be heard just as they are. That's when I started studying. While many people were trying to improve my way of speaking, I was immersed in books, reports, and case studies of companies that had implemented linguistic inclusion policies. I discovered that there were organizations that trained leaders to recognize their own unconscious biases about accents and regionalisms, that the simple way a person speaks can interfere with their chances of promotion, of receiving credit for an idea, of being taken seriously in a meeting. And this wasn't an assumption, it was data, facts, raw reality. And then it hit me. If the problem wasn't my English, but rather the way people heard it, maybe what needed to be adjusted wasn't my voice, but the entire system. And that's exactly what I decided to do. Not aggressively, not trying to shout louder, but conquering spaces, one excellent delivery at a time. Proving with results that no accent is an obstacle when you have the competence, vision, and courage to remain authentic in an environment that wants to shape you. At that point in my life, I wasn't in charge of anything yet. I was still at the beginning of my journey. But there, in that discomfort, in that attempt to silence myself, a silent certainty was born. I was going to grow. I was going to get to a place where only standards were accepted, and I was going to make room for those who carry in their words the strength of their origin. Because I never spoke wrong. I just didn't speak like them. And that one day would make all the difference. It was my first day at a US company, and the prejudice came before the badge. I arrived early. I was nervous, but determined. My resume was strong, I had years of experience, a solid education, fluency in English, and a history of overcoming obstacles that had been with me since my adolescence. Like many immigrants, I came from a background in which every achievement was pulled out of the concrete with my own hands. Being there, in an American multinational, occupying a position in a strategic sector, was a symbol, a sign that, despite all the obstacles, I was winning. I walked in through the main door with my backpack on my back and my heart beating fast. The building was modern, the spaces all designed to seem inclusive, colorful, and open. There were motivational phrases on the walls, diversity murals, and even a panel with the flags of the countries represented by the team. But between the symbols and the practice, there was a chasm. As soon as I walked into the lobby, I was greeted by a surprised-looking employee. Her eyes dropped from my documents to my face, and she frowned slightly before asking, "Are you the new hire in operations?" I nodded with a smile, and she said, "Oh, I thought you'd be different." Different in what way? White? Born in Chicago? No accent? I don't know exactly what she meant, and maybe she didn't know herself. But I knew. I felt it right away. The kind of look that doesn't hold eye contact for long. The kind of sentence that starts softly, but ends with an uncomfortable pause. I had just arrived, and already they knew I was out of the norm. During the welcome tour, we were introduced to the team, the internal systems, and the company's procedures. I asked questions, interacted, and contributed, but I noticed that some colleagues were avoiding more direct contact. One or another made a point of repeating what I had just said, as if they were translating something incomprehensible. During the first group lunch, an employee made a joke about my country of origin. It wasn't explicitly offensive, but it carried that subtle tone of superiority, as if being Latino, or African, or Asian meant trying to measure up. No one laughed, but no one reprimanded either, and that said a lot. Later that day, at an internal meeting, I presented a suggestion based on experiences I had at other companies. I argued clearly, with technical support, and heard in return, "Let's check that with someone more familiar with our culture." That phrase kept echoing in my head. More familiar with our culture. Which culture? The companies? The cities? The countries? Or simply the culture of the right way to speak, act, behave? I realized that there was a set of invisible codes that were not in the best practices manual, but that determined who would be listened to and who would be tolerated. What became clear on that first day, more than any formal integration, was that I was entering a space where my identity would be constantly tested. And that, as much as the company said it cared about diversity, that was still more talk than practice. It was as if they wanted diversity on paper, in the campaign, in the annual report, but not in the day-to-day, not in the accent of those who speak, nor in the style of those who propose, much less in leadership. Diversity there was still performative, and this initial impact had a profound effect on me. Because I grew up hearing that studying would change everything, that effort would take me far. But on that first day, I realized that there is a hidden filter, which is not declared out loud, but acts silently. It selects who seems trustworthy, who is seen as a reference, who is easily promoted. And this filter has to do with appearance, origin, intonation, subtle traits that accumulate in important decisions. I returned home that day with a heavy mind. I could have kept quiet and tried to adapt, as so many do. I could have started to neutralize my presence until I fit into that mold, but there was something inside me that would no longer accept this role of temporary guest on its own merit. I had the right to be there, not because of a quota, not because of charity, but because of competence. And if I accepted hiding in order to be accepted, I would be reinforcing exactly what so many before me had fought to change. That night, instead of feeling defeated, something clicked. I started writing. I wrote down everything I felt, all the microaggressions, the silences, the looks. Not as a way to vent, but as raw material for change. I realized that my experience could be transformed into fuel, not just for me, but to pave the way for those who would come after. It was just the beginning. A hard beginning, but a necessary one. Because the prejudice came before the badge. But my answer would come before the next performance review. And it would be so solid, so indisputable, that they would have no choice but to listen. They said my English needed to sound more American. I just wanted to be heard. It wasn't long before the real filter began to show itself more clearly. It wasn't just one meeting or another. It was a constant. There was always someone, usually someone above me in the hierarchy, who was willing to correct my pronunciation, adjust my intonation, quietly recommend executive communication training so I could improve my verbal clarity. What they meant, even if they masked it with corporate euphemisms, was that my English needed to sound more American, less marked, less foreign. And every time I heard that phrase, it sounded like a silent scream saying, "Your place here depends on how well you can erase your identity." He was violent, even when he smiled, and he was even more cruel precisely because he didn't shout or insult me directly. He came with that tone of supposedly neutral professionalism, where the violence isn't in the words themselves, but in the subtext. I wasn't being evaluated by the quality of my ideas, but by the format in which they were delivered. As if my content lost value because the packaging had a different rhythm, a melody outside the standard score. And that hurt, because it put me in a position of constant surveillance. Every sentence I said was analyzed in millimeter detail, not for what it meant, but for how it sounded to the ears of those who thought their way of speaking was the universal standard of excellence. There was a time, in a meeting with leaders from different departments, when I defended a systems integration solution based on something I had implemented in another multinational company. I presented the results, showed the graphs, compared scenarios. The argument was solid. The solution was simple, scalable, and low cost. But after I finished speaking, the senior manager responded with a polite smile. "That's interesting. Maybe we can revisit this idea once we have it presented in a way that everyone feels more aligned with." He didn't criticize the content. He didn't point out flaws. He simply said that perhaps with another approach, perhaps with a more familiar intonation, the proposal could be better absorbed. Little by little, I began to understand that this professional environment treated language as an invisible passport. Those who spoke with the right accent, the right rhythm, the right vocabulary had access. They were listened to more carefully. Their suggestions were given more credit, even when they weren't the best. It was a deep-rooted bias, which presented itself as a personal preference, but was deep down a structure of exclusion. And it wasn't just me. I began to observe how other immigrant colleagues were also going through the same thing. A brilliant Indian woman in the technology sector, for example, had a project shelved even after demonstrating positive results in internal tests. A French executive commented that he only began to be taken seriously after forcing a complete neutralization of his accent. It was a constant, an invisible but effective pattern. And the great irony was that while I was being asked to sound more American, the company loved to say at public events that it was a multicultural workplace. They used words like inclusion, diversity, global collaboration. They had pamphlets with pictures of people of different ethnicities smiling together. They had days of celebration for foreign cultures. But in practice, if you didn't fit into the dominant cultural mold, you had to adapt or you were isolated. Diversity was celebrated up to the point where it didn't threaten the traditional model of leadership, communication, or behavior. At that point, I had already understood that my presence there was not enough. I needed to do more, but not in the sense of erasing myself. Quite the opposite. I needed to become even more visible, even more efficient, even more strategically irreproachable. It was the only way to force them to listen to me. And at the same time, I needed to build a path in which other people like me, with similar accents, stories, and pains, would not have to go through the same exhaustion. So I started to adjust my focus. I kept delivering more than I was asked to, anticipating solutions, leading small projects, even though I didn't officially have that role yet. I started to study the company's unspoken codes. I observed how leaders communicated, how favorites were treated, what behaviors received the most recognition. But instead of trying to copy them, I decided to reinterpret those codes in my own way. Not because I wanted to hide, but because I understood that in order to change the system, I would first need to master it. At the same time, outside of work hours, I began to delve deeper into studies on linguistic bias in the workplace. I discovered academic research showing how non-native accents are automatically associated with lower credibility, even when the content spoken is identical to that of a native speaker. I read about experiments in which the same presentation received different scores depending on the accent of the speaker. I saw alarming data. Candidates with foreign names and accents received fewer calls for interviews, even with resumes identical to those of native candidates. It was a global problem, structural, and the worst part, many companies didn't even know it existed. That gave me fuel. I realized that I could turn this pain into action, that the discomfort of being constantly corrected, silenced, and underestimated could become the basis for something bigger. But first, I had to keep resisting. I had to keep my authenticity intact. Because deep down, what I wanted was not to seem more American. I just wanted to be heard. I wanted my voice to be recognized for its strength, its experience, its legitimacy. I wanted the company that claimed to value diversity to be able to live it in the details as well. And the accent in that scenario was the first and most visible sign that we were still far from that. From then on, I began to plan not only my individual growth, but also how I could create spaces to listen to other voices like mine. And I knew that to do so, I would have to win first. I would have to reach the top, because only those who sit at the decision-making table can change the menu. Only those who are listened to with respect can open the ears of others to new things. I didn't want to conform to the standard. I wanted to rediscuss the standard. And to do so, every word I spoke, even with an accent, would be a hammer blow to this invisible wall. This process would be long. I knew it. But there was no turning back. Because once you understand that you are being asked to be quiet in a polite or disguised way, there is no way to unhear it. And the only possible response is to keep talking. More firmly, more clearly, louder, not in volume, but in conviction. Because every time someone says that your English needs to sound more American, what they are saying is that you are not good enough as you are, and I would never accept that again. Being different taught me to listen to what no one else listened to. It's strange to realize how, when you're outside the mold, you start to see details that those inside never noticed. While everyone else was trying hard to look the same, fit in, and be appropriate, I was observing what was left out. Those small gestures of discomfort when someone with an unusual name tried to introduce themselves in a meeting, the whispered jokes in the hallway when a colleague with shaky English asked a question, the almost complete absence of leaders with accents, with visible racial traits, or with clothes that were out of the norm. Being different in that environment was almost like having a silent superpower. It didn't give me an advantage, quite the opposite, but it gave me clarity. I saw what others didn't see. And more than that, I heard. While my peers seemed focused solely on moving up, I was paying attention to those who were being pushed to the sidelines. Talented people, often more qualified than current leaders, who lived in a permanent state of invisibility. For example, there was a Nigerian analyst who spoke 4 languages, managed crises with precision, and was called complicated because she preferred not to participate in conversations about American football. A brilliant Filipino developer who could create solutions in days that took others weeks, but who was constantly interrupted in meetings because he spoke too softly. In fact, because his voice was not treated with the same authority. These people had no voice, not because they lacked competence, but because the system was never designed to listen to them. And as I tried to adapt, I realized that there was a choice to be made. Either I continued trying to fit into a place where my worth had to be constantly proven, or I used what I saw and heard to transform that space. Being different in that context forced me to develop a much more active listening style. I listened to more than just words. I listened to the silence after certain lines. I listened to the nervous laughter after a grammatical error. I listened to the long pauses between praise and criticism, as if people were measuring how much they could recognize our merit without giving us too much power. And it was by listening in detail that I began to put together a map of what didn't work, of what was excluded, of what was tolerated, but never valued. I began to understand that the problem was not specific. It wasn't about me. It wasn't about my accent, or how I dressed, or my posture. It was structural. A system that claimed to celebrate diversity, but in practice only promoted those who knew how to perform in artificial uniformity. And it was at this point that listening became a strategy. Instead of simply reacting to microaggressions or trying to survive them, I began to record, analyze, and connect the dots. I discovered that in many companies, these patterns were maintained more out of inertia than malice. No one woke up thinking about excluding, but no one made a real effort to truly include either. And the lack of action was, in itself, a form of violence, as was the lack of listening. So I decided to use this heightened listening as a tool. I began to reach out to people who also felt the discomfort of their place. In silence, we formed a network. Exchanges over coffee, discreet conversations via text, shared observations. Little by little, I realized that I was not alone. I was just in an environment where being who I was meant being pushed toward loneliness. It was with this silent network that we began to sketch out ideas. Small proposals for change. Adjustments to onboarding so that foreign names were pronounced correctly. suggestions for training on unconscious bias, more structured feedback so that it was not based on subjective impressions. At first, of course, little was taken seriously. But each of these actions was like a seed, and I knew, if the soil was not ready, it was because they had not yet listened carefully. That's when I decided to do something riskier. At a meeting with HR, when they asked how the organizational climate could be improved, I stood up. I talked about active listening, about how talent was being underutilized, how the company was losing value when it insisted on standardizing voices, styles, stories. I showed data I had gathered. I gave examples that didn't name names, but that exposed truths. And for the first time, I saw attentive eyes. It wasn't a miracle. It didn't change everything. But it was a gap. And a gap is all that change needs to begin. From then on, they started calling me to strategic meetings. At first, I was still the alternative view. But over time, my analyses began to be valued. They discovered that someone who listens a lot is also someone who proposes with more precision. I saw what no one else saw because I was on the sidelines. And precisely because of that, I saw the whole picture more clearly. Being different, after all, taught me to listen without filters, to notice what is being kept quiet. And it was this listening that, without me realizing it, was preparing me to lead. Because before leading people, you need to understand them. And to understand, you need to truly listen. It was this path of listening that led me to understand that transformation would not come from the top down. It would have to start underground, in unofficial conversations, in the glances exchanged between the different, who did not yet know that they were not alone. Being different gave me this listening. It forced me to pay attention to the cracks. And every structure that has cracks, no matter how small, can be transformed, as long as someone has the courage to listen to them carefully. At that moment, I didn't know that this silent listening was the beginning of something bigger, but I felt that a mission was taking shape, a desire that went beyond growing alone. I wanted to reconfigure what it meant to be heard in that company. I wanted people with accents, with stories, with deep impressions, to be respected for who they are, and not just for how much they can hide. Listening became action, and that's when change began to take on a name, a face, and a direction. Because being different taught me to listen to what no one else was listening to. And listening, in this case, was the first step to changing everything. While they were asking me to change, I was studying how to change the system. The pressure to adapt was constant, sometimes direct, sometimes disguised as advice. It came in subtle forms. A recommendation for a diction course, a suggestion to adapt my posture to align with the company's standards, a compliment that brought along a disguised criticism. You're very good, you just need to be a little more diplomatic. And diplomacy in this context was not about respect or empathy. It was about avoiding confrontation, silencing differences, softening one's own identity until it no longer bothered anyone. All around me, I saw colleagues losing themselves in this. With each adjustment, they left a piece of themselves behind, and many didn't even realize it. All they felt was the fatigue, the invisible wear and tear of living as a character on a corporate stage where the scripts were already written before you even entered the scene. But I decided to do something different. I realized that if I just focused on fitting in, I would spend my whole life trying to occupy a space that would never truly be mine. So I started studying. Not just studying the company, its policies, its leaders, but studying the system itself. I wanted to understand how an organizational culture is built. I wanted to find out where this invisible pattern came from that decided who would be promoted and who would be overlooked. And I dug deep. I started with articles on diversity and inclusion, but soon I delved into sociology, organizational psychology, behavioral neuroscience, and everything that could give me tools to understand the invisible structures of power. I wanted to do more than survive there. I wanted to learn how it worked, and where the cracks were that could be opened. The nights I used to spend rehearsing neutral answers or trying to adapt my accent, I spent reading research, watching lectures, talking to people who had already walked this path. I discovered that in companies with culturally diverse leaders, innovation increased by an average of 19%. Employees who feel represented at the top tend to be more productive, more loyal, more engaged. But I also discovered that, in most organizations, inclusion stops at the hiring stage. They hire for the appearance of diversity, but only promote those who fit the dominant pattern. It was as if there was an invisible ceiling, not made of glass, but of echo. You can speak, but your voice doesn't spread. Understanding this was like finding the map of the maze. I realized that it wasn't enough to just speak louder. I had to learn the language of the system. And that's what I did. I started participating in internal discussion groups about culture and values. I made sure to be present at the less glamorous meetings, but where real decisions were made. I observed how ideas were received when they came from people who looked like the directors. I saw how selective empathy was, and how much unconscious bias guided these choices. It wasn't about malice, it was about repetition. People promoting people who looked like them, spoke like them, acted like them. A cycle that would only be broken if someone could prove that being different wasn't a risk, it was an advantage. Meanwhile, I kept delivering results. Each successful project was a piece in the puzzle. Each formal accolade was filed away as proof that my voice had value, even if it came with an accent. I knew that it wasn't enough to be good. I had to be unquestionable, because only then could I become a reference. And by being a reference, I could start to challenge previous references. Those that said that the ideal leader had a certain tone of voice, a certain style of speech, a certain way of carrying themselves. I wanted to turn the mirror around, show that there was another way. Over time, I began to be asked to provide input on processes, first informally, then as part of internal committees. Before I knew it, I was helping to review internal performance appraisal policies. And there, between meetings, I began to plant the first real seeds of change. I proposed creating an active listening program for foreign employees. We suggested that feedback interviews be conducted with outside observers to reduce confirmation bias. We pushed for leaders to undergo training in intercultural communication, not to teach others how to sound more American, but to teach Americans how to listen to the world. Each small victory was preceded by a battle, sometimes discreet, sometimes internal, because the biggest challenge wasn't always convincing others. It was keeping alive within myself the certainty that I was on the right path. Because in the middle of the process, there are always moments when you doubt, when you wonder if it wouldn't have been easier to give in, to pretend a little, to adjust just one more detail. But every time this doubt arose, I remembered the initial reason. I didn't want to just get by. I wanted to open up paths, open up voices, open up possibilities. And it's curious how the system starts to change when it realizes that you know it, when it realizes that you have mastered the rules. Because it doesn't know what to do with someone who not only challenges it, but also understands its logic. When that happens, you stop being seen as a foreign body. You start to be recognized as someone strategic. And from that point on, the game changes. There is still resistance, of course. There always will be. But there is also respect. And with respect comes real opportunities. It was like this, studying the system while they tried to mold me, that I began to gain space. Not because I became the same, but because I showed that difference was not a mistake. It was a project for the future that only those who know the margins can design. A project that only those who listen to silence can begin. A project that is born from discomfort and blossoms in the insistence of not being silent. And it was this choice, to study the system instead of bowing to it, that prepared me for the next step. Because at that point, I no longer wanted to just understand how everything worked. I wanted, in fact, to redesign the foundations. And that was what I was beginning to do. Voices like mine never made it to the top. So I climbed up there. From the first months at that company, there was an invisible ladder hovering over all of us. It wasn't in the organizational charts or the corporate presentations, but everyone knew it existed. A ladder of influence, power, and visibility. On paper, everyone had access to it. But in practice, the steps were selective. There were unspoken criteria for who could naturally climb the ladder, and they rarely involved only technical competence or results delivered. It was more subtle. It involved tone of voice, appearance, connections, shared cultural repertoire, even personal tastes that coincided with those of the majority at the top. And I, with my accent, my migrant background, and my different way of thinking, was not part of that pattern. At first, this ladder seemed unattainable. I saw less experienced colleagues being promoted for knowing how to conduct hallway conversations, for being able to laugh at the right jokes, or for being invited to happy hour with the directors. I realized that more than half of the important decisions were not made in boardrooms, but behind the scenes, in informal conversations, exclusive dinners, and silent exchanges of favors. Meanwhile, I continued to deliver results with precision, lead successful initiatives, and build teams that performed above average. But still, the recognition always came in half. as if there were a glass wall between where I was and the space of real leadership. But I had already decided that I would not back down. He had already understood that the system would not change spontaneously. And more than that, I realized that I could only transform it if I was inside it, with a voice, a vote, and influence. So I began to draw up my plan to climb that ladder, step by step, even if each one required 10 times more effort than the others. The first thing I did was map out who the decision makers were. Not just those in high positions, but those with internal credibility, whose opinions shaped collective behavior. I began to study their communication styles, their references, the types of arguments they valued. But unlike before, when I was tempted to imitate them in order to be accepted, this time I chose to be strategic without losing my identity. I adapted my approach, but maintained my content. I made my proposals firmly, but without softening my essence. Over time, these same people began to notice something different. I was not just another hardworking collaborator. I was someone who brought a vision they didn't have, someone who made connections they didn't see, someone who, coming from the outside, had learned to read the system better than many who were born into it. This gave me a silent but powerful advantage. I started being called to participate in high-impact projects, not because I was given a generous invitation, but because I became indispensable. I mastered the processes, delivered results, knew where the bottlenecks were and how to solve them. More than that, I became a reference for other colleagues who also felt left out. They started looking for me for guidance, advice, support. And this movement gave me even more strength, because it showed that my presence was not only necessary for me, it was essential for others. An important milestone was when a project I led, focused on optimizing operational flows between teams from different cultures, resulted in significant savings for the company. During the final presentation, I presented data, testimonials, and concrete evidence of the positive impact of the diverse approach. For the first time, the leadership remained silent, not out of disinterest, but because of the impact. There was no denying that the solution had only emerged because someone with my experience, my perspective, my repertoire had led the process. This was the first time one of the directors had called me to talk outside of the formal setting. He wanted to better understand my background and my ideas. And right there, in that conversation, I realized that I had crossed a symbolic boundary. I was no longer just a hard-working employee who spoke with an accent. I was a strategic asset, a competitive differentiator. This changed the tone of the interactions, and little by little, I began to be included in decisions. I was invited to participate in internal innovation groups, then executive committees, and finally, when a management position opened, my name came up not as a surprise, but as a natural suggestion. The promotion came with resistance. There were those who questioned my quiet leadership, my direct style, my way of dealing with conflicts. But the results spoke for themselves, and even those who were not in favor knew that it was riskier to ignore me than to give me space. Taking on that position was more than professional recognition. It was a statement. Voices like mine also have a place in leadership. And more than that, they are missed when they are not there. Once in office, my mission became clear. I didn't want to just sit in a chair. I wanted to redesign the table. I wanted to open doors that had previously been locked by invisible standards. I began revamping hiring processes to ensure that different accents and styles weren't treated as flaws. I held internal workshops on inclusive communication, brought in experts to talk about unconscious bias, and established objective criteria for performance evaluation that weren't based on cultural fit, but on actual competence. In less than a year, the team under my leadership became the most diverse in the organization, and also the most productive. Not because I was a genius, but because I allowed people to be their whole selves, without masks, without filters, without the burden of having to prove every day that they belonged. And that generated trust. And trust generated innovation. The ladder that once seemed unattainable became the path that others began to follow. Not because it became easier, but because there was now a reference at the top. Someone with an accent, with a story, with scars, who showed that it was possible. And that made all the difference. I didn't climb that ladder to gain power. I climbed it because I understood that without occupying decision-making positions, everything we believe about inclusion and equity remains just talk. And talk without action is just marketing. But when a different voice reaches the top, it changes the sound of the entire organization. And that's what I was starting to do. Not because it was expected, but because it was necessary. I created the company's first internal diversity proposal, and no one took it seriously. I knew that holding a leadership position was a milestone, but it wasn't the end of the journey. On the contrary, it was the starting point of something much bigger. I had gotten there by overcoming the silence, the distrust, and the invisible barriers imposed by a system that historically marginalized everything that didn't fit its traditional mold. But being at the top, or close to it, didn't mean that the system had changed. It just meant that, at that moment, someone like me had managed to break through. And that was exactly why I knew. I needed to pave the way so that more people could do the same, without having to bleed so much in the process. It was with this conviction that I decided to structure, for the first time in the company's history, a formal diversity, equity, and inclusion proposal. The idea came from listening that I had been cultivating for years. I had noted patterns, collected anonymous feedback, studied cases of companies that had solid results in promoting real inclusion. I knew that it was not enough to put pretty phrases on an institutional notice board. True inclusion required intentional action, metrics, and shared responsibility. So I spent weeks immersed in internal data, reviewing hiring processes, analyzing promotion rates, and mapping ignored profiles. And everything pointed to what I already knew. Diversity existed at the operational levels, but disappeared as we moved up the pyramid. Based on this, I put together a robust project. A comprehensive program with clear goals, educational initiatives, a timeline of actions, and measurable impact. I presented proposals for training on unconscious bias, reformulation of performance evaluation criteria, review of the selection process to ensure greater equity, and even the creation of affinity groups to give a voice to employees from diverse backgrounds. The document was over 30 pages long, based on research, success stories, and internal data from the company itself. When I delivered it to the executive committee, I believed that the material spoke for itself. But that was not what happened. At the presentation meeting, I quickly realized that they were not ready for this. The faces at the table listened with superficial attention. Some leafed through the documents as if they were just waiting for time to pass. Others asked generic questions, disconnected from the content. And when I finished, the first comment was a familiar cliché. We like the initiative, but perhaps this is not the ideal time for such profound changes. The market is unstable, and the focus now needs to be on financial performance. It was a polite but completely empty response. A polite way of saying, let's not touch that right now. Other comments followed the same line. We need to mature this type of discussion. Maybe we should start with something simpler, like an internal campaign. Or even, couldn't this type of action polarize the environment? It was as if the simple fact of talking about inclusion was, in itself, a threat to the harmony of the company. As if naming the problem would create a problem. The proposal was shelved. Without fanfare, without debate. It was simply placed on the shelf of topics that did not deserve urgency. That week, I felt an immense weight. Not because of the rejection of the project itself, but because that response showed me that, for many there, what I represented was still something to be tolerated, not welcomed. I had become a leader, but not a member. And worse, the resistance did not come with shouting or confrontation. It was silent, strategic, dressed in formality and neutrality. But the message was clear. They did not want to change what, for them, already worked. I thought for a moment about backing down, about stopping pushing, about accepting that perhaps real change was beyond my reach. But then, taking a deep breath, I realized that this rejection was also a confirmation. A sign that the establishment felt threatened by the proposal not because it was radical, but because it was possible. The proposal was too solid to ignore. That's why they had to disguise their rejection with a veneer of caution. And that made me even more certain that I was on the right track. I decided to change the strategy. If the top didn't want to listen, I would start at the grassroots level. I took the content of the proposal to the teams. I organized informal meetings with middle leaders. I created discussion groups. I invited employees to share their stories. I made the ignored data visible. Little by little, the proposal stopped being just mine. It started to become an issue among the teams, in the hallways, in smaller meetings. And then something started to happen. The pressure came from below. Some leaders began to contact me to adapt parts of the proposal for their areas. Pilot projects emerged spontaneously. One sector implemented a review of feedback criteria. Another adopted the practice of structured interviews to reduce bias. The culture began to change, even without formal approval from the top, and this attracted attention. A director who had previously been skeptical called me in to talk. He wanted to understand why his team, which had adopted part of the project, was delivering more and reporting greater satisfaction. I showed him the data. I showed him the testimonials. And this time, he listened. The proposal was brought back to the table months later, now not as an idealistic plan, but as a necessary response to a real demand. The board, pressured by results and internal movement, began to give in. And so, step by step, the project was implemented. Not as it had been envisioned, but as it could be at that time. And that was enough to open the door. That first rejection hurt, but it served to show that no one makes room for themselves with good ideas alone. It takes persistence. It needs to show that change, even if uncomfortable, is inevitable. And more than that, it is desired. Today, that project that was ignored is the basis for all new hires. It's in onboarding. It's in management goals. It's in performance reports. It's in everyday conversations. No one took it seriously at first, but now, no one can pretend not to see it. Because what starts with one voice can, with persistence, become political. And what was once shelved as radical can become essential. That's how I understood that sometimes, what seems like a defeat is just the beginning of a change that's bigger than we imagine. A change that starts where many have given up. And that continues, even when no one applauds. Because real transformation doesn't come from the stage. It's born behind the scenes. And it survives in the silence of those who don't give up. What they ignored became a market demand, and now they are chasing losses. The irony of history is that what was once treated with disdain, disinterest, and even a certain contempt disguised as caution became exactly what the company was now desperately rushing to implement. The proposal that had been shelved, the ideas that had been classified as premature, the project that seemed too bold for the moment, all of this came back to the surface, not because the leadership's mindset had matured out of awareness, but because the market came knocking on the door. And it didn't ask for permission. It demanded it. In the years that followed the initial rejection of my diversity proposal, the world changed faster than many imagined. Discrimination scandals broke out at other companies. Investors began to demand more rigorous ESG indicators, and talent began to reject proposals from companies that did not demonstrate concrete inclusion actions. It was a new era, and in it, diversity ceased to be a nice differentiator in institutional discourse. It became a criterion for staying in the game, and those who did not keep up were left behind. Our company, like so many others, was slow to catch on. While entire departments were reproducing the same old hiring, promotion, and communication patterns, the marketplace was changing before our eyes. Clients began to question more frequently how our teams were composed. Partners began to ask about our policies for ensuring equal opportunities. Competitors began to proudly publicize their representation metrics. And younger, more connected, and more attentive talent began to choose to work where they felt they could be their whole selves, not where they had to perform to belong. It was then that the executive committee, which had previously completely ignored the diversity project, realized that it could no longer put the issue on hold. The pressure was now coming from all sides. And the most symbolic thing was seeing the same group that had previously said, "It's not the right time," turn to me and ask, "Do you still have that material you presented a while ago? We're thinking about revisiting this subject." There was no apology, no formal acknowledgement, but there was urgency, a rush disguised as strategy. They were playing catch-up. I could have refused. I could have reminded them that I had been ignored when I had proposed this with time, calmness, and planning. But it wasn't about me. It never was. So I took a deep breath and replied, "Yes, I do. And I've updated it with the most recent data." I returned to the table, no longer as the insistent employee, but as an expert, as a reference. And this time, my voice wasn't treated as noise. It was treated as a solution. The proposal was reread, adapted, and approved in stages. We created indicators. We implemented goals. We formed committees. And everything that had previously seemed radical was now seen as urgent. The most interesting thing was to see how, as the results began to appear, the same executives who had resisted began to publicly position themselves as defenders of the agenda. They began to give interviews, write articles, and participate in panels. Some spoke with such authority that, to those who didn't know the story, it seemed like they had been pioneers. But I didn't mind. Because the most important thing was that, finally, it was being done. And the results came. Fast. The sectors that adopted inclusive policies saw increased productivity. reduced turnover, and greater internal engagement. Clients began to mention our progress as a competitive advantage. We won awards and were invited to participate in international forums. And, almost comically, what was once considered a risk became a strategic asset. But few people saw the price of delay. While other companies were already reaping the rewards of having started this process years earlier, we were still in our infancy. We lost brilliant talent who didn't feel welcomed. We lost contracts because our competitors were more advanced. We wasted time. And time, in this scenario, is the most valuable asset. Seeing all this happen generated mixed feelings. On the one hand, there was satisfaction in knowing that my persistence had planted the seed of a real transformation. On the other, there was frustration in knowing that it could have started earlier, with less pain, with more consistency, if they had listened from the beginning. But this contradiction is part of the process, because every profound change encounters resistance. And, unfortunately, it often only moves forward when reality forces it to. However, there was something even more powerful happening behind the scenes. The new generation of employees was arriving differently. They no longer accepted the old rules. They questioned everything. They proposed changes without fear. And, to my surprise, many of them had already read articles I wrote, attended my lectures, followed the example of the projects we led. I realized that, in addition to changing processes, we had changed the mindset. Being different was no longer synonymous with barriers. It was a sign of vision, adaptability, and competitive advantage. Now, when I look at that project, the same one that was once ignored, I see more than a successful plan. I see concrete proof that whatever the system rejects out of fear, it will eventually seek out of necessity. And that is a valuable lesson. Not just for those in leadership positions, but for everyone who was once treated as an exception. Because what is celebrated today as innovation almost always began as resistance. And those who resist, who insist, who remain true to their own voice even when it is silenced, are the true precursors of the new. They see what the rest do not yet see. They build what the future will thank them for. The company ran after its losses, and with a lot of effort it began to recover. But it will never again be able to say that it was not warned. Because every time they ignored a proposal, every time they said it's not the time, they made it clear that they did not understand what was coming. And understanding what is coming is, in the end, the difference between leading and just reacting. I chose to lead, even when no one followed me, even when no one listened to me. Because I knew that one day, everything that seemed like an exaggeration would become essential. And that's exactly what happened. Today, I am the one who approves the policies that previously excluded me. There is a specific silence that only exists at the moment you sign an institutional document with symbolic weight. When that paper that reaches you for final approval carries the memory of a past where your voice was not heard, and where decisions were made by people who did not even recognize your existence as a legitimate part of the space. It was not just another form. It was a new code of conduct on diversity and inclusion. The same topic that once caused resistance was now on my desk. But above all, it now depended on my signature. A simple pen, a click of approval. But for me, it was much more. It was the materialization of a cycle that began on the other side of the table, where I was the employee who had to constantly prove that his perspective was valid. Being in that position wasn't just about holding a position. It was about rewriting, with action and responsibility, an entire narrative of exclusion. It wasn't enough to have gotten there. You had to make sure that others didn't have to go through the same barriers. What had previously been an ignored suggestion was now mandatory policy. The change that I had once been asked to postpone, claiming that the timing was not right, was now considered urgent, strategic, essential. And I was the one who said what was included, what needed to be revised, what was not yet up to the level of the transformation we had been building. The feeling of being at this point in the journey is, at the same time, intense and silent. Because there is no fanfare, no applause, no explicit recognition. The system, even in change, is still discreet in celebrating voices that it once tried to silence. But it is not about waiting for applause. It is about understanding that the true power of transformation lies precisely in the possibility of changing structures from the inside out, without needing to announce that you are making history, just doing it. I remember when I first started looking at internal policy documents as an analyst. They were cold, impersonal texts, almost always written in generic language. They spoke of equality, but did not name prejudice. They promised opportunities, but did not explain the mechanisms that blocked them. And there, between paragraphs and clauses, there was always an absence. The absence of me, of my history, of my reality, of the reality of so many. Now, as I review each word of these new guidelines, I make a point of including what was once left out, not for revenge, but for justice, for truth, for balance. Inclusion policies are not, as many still think, concessions. They are not gifts that leadership gives to minorities. They are corrective mechanisms, tools for rebuilding an environment that, for too long, operated under the logic of exclusion disguised as neutrality. And understanding this is fundamental for any DEI program to be effective. When I sign these policies, I am validating not only rules, but intentions. I am saying, now, what was once subjective becomes commitment. What was once veiled practice becomes unacceptable. What was once privilege now needs to be equity. Each new procedure implemented, whether in the selection process, promotion criteria, mandatory training, or climate assessments, is designed based on data, but also on memories. Because memory has a role that data alone cannot fulfill. It humanizes the decision. It brings real, lived, concrete impact. And it is with this perspective that I create the guidelines. I make a point of listening to the people who now occupy the positions where I once was. I make a point of consulting the younger voices, the newest in the company, the furthest from leadership positions. Because this is the distance I experienced, and I know how it makes policies always seem like they were created from above, by people who have never felt the burden of keeping quiet to keep their jobs. Today, alongside other leaders, we have built a new listening model. We have created permanent forums with rotating participation, where employees from different areas, positions, and backgrounds share what the processes do not yet capture. And the most powerful thing is to see that this movement is expanding. That other leaders, previously indifferent, are beginning to see the value in active listening, in intentional inclusion, in real change. Some, of course, still resist. But now, the structure is on our side. The guidelines are documented. The responsibility is clear, and so is the accountability. Transforming the place you came from requires more than just getting to the top. It requires courage to not conform to what is already established. It requires clarity to remember why you wanted to change the system in the first place. And above all, it requires constant action, because policies can be approved, but their implementation depends on vigilance. Corporate culture is slow to change, and if it is not nurtured every day with examples, with coherence, with practice, it will fall back into the previous pattern. So my job now is to ensure that changes are not isolated, but structural. That the leaders of the future find an environment that is fairer, more honest, more open. That the ladder I once climbed with triple the effort is more accessible, more diverse, more transparent. And that no one will ever have to question whether they will be heard because of the way they speak, the origin of their name, the way they dress or behave. Being the person who signs inclusion policies today is, for me, an untransferable responsibility. It is the chance to ensure that the pain I felt does not need to be repeated, that the exclusion that once limited me serves as a basis for inclusion, that the struggle I fought serves as a path. Because true transformation does not happen when you are accepted into the system. It begins when you have the power to redesign the rules that previously excluded you. And this, perhaps, is the most profound act of justice that someone can perform within an organization.